And just hopefully this isn't taking the Sota conversation too far, but I do want to spend just a couple more minutes on it. It'll be pretty brief. I know we're running long this morning because we've already talked about this so much, but there were a couple perspectives that I have actually prepared this morning that thankfully didn't come up in conversation, and that I think are worth sharing. So I want to just give a really brief and explicit overview of the steps in the Sota process. It starts with a married woman who is accused of adultery by her husband, and she doesn't admit to wrongdoing, or of course, there is no wrongdoing for her to admit to, one or the other. And there are no witnesses, and her husband is overcome with jealousy. All of these conditions must exist for us to move on to the step of actually enacting the Sota ritual. And so they go to the high priest, and her husband brings a grain offering, and the high priest makes this concoction that involves what is referred to as Mayim Kadosh, some kind of holy water, consecrated water, some earth from the floor of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, and he mixes it all together. And then to add to this mixture, he first verbally recites a series of kind of curses of warning to the woman, and then he writes these curses down and takes that piece of paper on which these curses are written and kind of dissolves them in what is then called the water of bitterness. Then the priest offers the grain offering that her husband has brought on the altar, and then she drinks the water. And this is really kind of the climax of this trial by ordeal. She drinks the water, and we kind of wait for some sort of immediate guilt or innocence. Is she okay? Did she kind of pass the test? Or does her body betray her guilt with physical symptoms manifesting themselves and manifesting her guilt in front of her husband and the priest? And as we've already discussed, not only making sense of this, but really kind of finding redemptive lenses through this for this ritual is really hard to do. It is certainly patriarchal and probably misogynistic. And it's really, a lot of this really doesn't seem to be about the woman. It is really much more so about the husband's jealousy. And of course, as we already highlighted, that last verse, chapter 5, verse 31, that no matter what happens, after the woman is publicly humiliated, no matter what happens, the man shall be clear of guilt, but the woman shall suffer for her guilt. And this verse, more than anything else, I think certainly brings out my own discomfort. And I think it actually brings out a lot of discomfort going much, much farther back. Even going back to the times of the Mishnah, if you study there is extensive writing in the Mishnah and Talmud on the Sota ritual. And even the rabbis of the Mishnah were pretty uncomfortable with a lot of this ritual. Even they taught that from the time when male adulterers proliferated among the people as well, the ritual of Sota needed to be discontinued, with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai officially nullifying it and essentially teaching that people in glass houses should not throw stones. The Torah seems to think that male adultery either wasn't a thing or wasn't a culpable thing. By the time of the Mishnah, they're recognizing that a one-way ritual like this just can't work, and really doesn't jibe with human nature. And perhaps in that regard, maybe this Torah passage was one that was rarely, if ever, meant to be carried out in the first place. It seems like maybe the Torah is thinking about kind of the idealized Israelite society that we picture sometimes in the Torah text, right? Where bad things don't really happen, or that adultery would be, or even suspicion of adultery and jealousy would be such rare occurrences that we could actually kind of afford to make temple adjudication of these disputes a thing. I can't imagine that with all the other responsibilities of the priests that, you know, people bringing their common marital disputes and common jealous feelings to the tabernacle was something that the Torah would have wanted or envisioned. And I think we know how prevalent jealousy is and how uncontrollable it can be. That sometimes when those nagging thoughts enter our minds, there's really no way to let go of it. And what the Torah is laying out here is essentially a supernatural exorcism of our own human jealous inclination. And certainly it's not only a human occurrence. One of the things that this Sota ritual really closely harkens back to, and this ritual of someone being forced to drink these bitter waters, is of course the aftermath of the golden calf in the book of Exodus, when it was Moshe maybe, but certainly God being beset by a jealous rage. And one of the important steps in nullifying that rage was Moshe taking the golden calf, grinding it into a powder, and forcing the people to drink it. And although we don't get exactly what the aftermath of those bitter water rituals were, there's an understanding that the water was a part of the aftermath of cleansing and something we already talked about, which is ultimate reconciliation, right? That the whole episode of the golden calf was this kind of inflection point where God was tempted to kind of start over, but instead decides to keep going with these people who God feels have committed this wrongdoing. And so here we have, you know, basically a jealous God begetting a jealous people. And it is really difficult to think about Sota as a ritual of reconciliation. As a couple of you have expressed, it's really, really hard to think about, you know, sharing a house, let alone a bed, with someone who has been part of forcing you to go through this process of humiliation. But as we already mentioned, without knowing exactly what was in the ink, on a physical level, these bitter waters are probably gross and probably bitter, but also hopefully and probably largely innocuous. There's very little indication that there's any physical properties here in the ingredients in this mixture that would actually cause physical symptoms that would resemble what the Torah describes as the symptoms of guilt. I think we can hope that this ordeal is actually geared towards exoneration. And what comes with exoneration is an explicit blessing of fertility on the woman. And part of where that emphasis on fertility comes into this whole equation is that, assuming that the woman passes through this ordeal, assuming that after drinking the bitter waters, she is found to be innocent of suspicion and innocent of adultery, that if she is in fact pregnant after all of this, hopefully that pregnancy has been taken out from under the cloud of suspicion, both in her husband's eyes and in the nation's eyes. And in that way, if there is a child on the way, that child can be lovingly accepted not only into its home, but also into the Israelite people. And so this idea of reconciliation and making others whole is actually a theme from this morning's parsha that extends just beyond just the ritual of sota. Right before the section that we would have read right before where we started this morning's reading is actually about admitting the process of admitting guilt in cases of theft and in cases of sin from person to person. And in a case of theft, it's very explicitly mentioned, you have to give restitution for what you stole plus an additional 20%. And the idea is that 20%, it's not just about making people whole, it's about kind of overcompensating to really kind of bring to make the process of restitution and reconciliation complete. And I think that this parsha really pushes us to ask ourselves, how do we deal with our own shortcomings? How do we deal with suspicions of guilt and with our own guilt? And how do we deal with those suspicions of guilt in others? And when we do find that spirit of jealousy descending on us, that ruach kinah, what can we possibly do to set that aside and to work towards making ourselves whole again?